Well, thank you for coming. We'll go ahead and get started to be respectful of your time. I'm Dr. Jacky Dumas. I'm the Associate Dean of Humanities, and one of the things is I did last year as the interim dean of the College of Humanities and Sciences was start a speaker series called Liberal Arts in Action. And then we also had Vocare Emphasis Week all hit at the same time, so we thought that this would be a perfect combination for these. So I thank you for your attendance and your interest in not only the liberal arts but also Vocare. Long respected as the foundation of a fully rounded undergraduate education, the liberal arts remain essential to the 21st century world. Without an immediate, obvious vocational outcome, the study of the liberal arts sometimes comes under attack for being impractical. By working to ensure that people understand in the course of every learning challenge that disciplined thinking, refined judgment, creative synthesis, and collaborative dynamic are not only crucial to developing our professional abilities, but also our habits of mind that will serve us well throughout our lives and be primary contributors to our success. We can champion the formative power of the liberal arts foundation. As a reflection of that goal, I am pleased that you can take part in this Liberal Arts in Action series. Thanks for joining us for today's presentation and discussions as to the unique ways the liberal arts can help us connect to our surroundings and our surrounding world. Moreover, this is the kickoff event for Vocare Emphasis Week, so we'd like to say hello to Dr. Bill Carroll, who's the champion and spearhead of that endeavor. And part of our explorations this evening involves the combination of the liberal arts and vocation. You see, calling is more than missional, it's directional. And the things for which we are passionate are part of God's tug, as I like to call it, the tug on us. So first of all, God is the consummate scientist. From the quantum to the cosmic, He created it all. Our Heavenly Father is also the ultimate creator, artist, author. Everything that is beautiful, that is right, that is just, that is good comes from His essence. Finally, God is the Word, the Logos. So our need to communicate, to connect, and relate all stem from our study of His creation of ourselves and the interrelation of the two. In essence, this is the basis of the liberal arts, exploring knowledge which allows us to live freely within His creation. Our feature presenter today is Dr. Toby Coley, Associate Professor of English. Dr. Coley holds a Bachelor of Arts in English and Biblical Studies from the College at Southeastern, an MA in English from North Carolina State University, and a doctorate in Rhetoric and Writing from Bowling Green State University. His research investigates the connections between writing, ethics, digital media, and religion. He also conducts research on C.S. Lewis. His publications have been featured in Rhetoric Review, Computers and Composition Online, and Kairos, a journal of rhetoric, technology, and pedagogy, and the C.S. Lewis Journal. His book, Teaching with Digital Media in Writing Studies and Exploration of Responsibilities, was published in the fall of 2011. He also writes poetry, creative nonfiction, and short stories. His creative work has been featured in venues such as the Windhover, Black and White, and the Fiction Week Literary Review. Dr. Coley's presentation is Why Speak to Them in Parables, Rhetoric, Narrative, and the Human Condition.
Thank you. That didn't work either. There we go. Once upon a time, there was a mighty king who ruled from India all the way to China. Over the course of his reign, he learns that his brother's wife has been unfaithful and begins to question his own wife. Upon learning that the queen's infidelities are worse than his sister-in-law's, he has her killed. Heartbroken, the king decides that no woman can be trusted. He then concocts a plan to marry a different virgin every night, kill her in the morning before she can betray him. When at last his vizier runs out of virgins, the vizier's own daughter offers herself, and he reluctantly agrees. And on the night of the wedding, the vizier's daughter begins to weave a story. But she doesn't end the tale that night. Instead, the king spares her life in order to hear the end of the tale the subsequent night. At which time, as soon as she finishes the tale, she begins another tale and keeps him in tow and in suspense for over 1,000 nights. At the end of 1,001 nights, we ask ourselves, will she survive? Will Scheherazade run out of tales? This brief tale is the frame for 1,001 Nights. In the English translation, originally Arabian Nights, from which we get such familiar stories as Aladdin. While you may never be called upon to tell a story to save your life, I want to persuade you today that we all tell stories. And stories that constitute our lives. In After Virtue, Study in Moral Theory, a book with which some of you are familiar, Alistair McIntyre argues, in fact, that human beings are, in our practices, our actions, and our fictions, essentially storytelling animals. Take a moment and think back on your day today, or even yesterday. Did you ask your children, if you have them, what they did during their day? How about your spouse? How about your friends? How about your students? Did you ask them how they fared over our winter storm? How did they respond? It's likely they narrated the events of their day or of their week in a particular order, passing and pausing at moments to comment on the ones that were important to them. That's retelling. That's narrative. That's story. Why do we do this? That's what I want to talk about today. The answer, I think, is both intuitive and revealing. Communication theorist Michael Goldberg has argued that all the facts and experiences of our lives stand in need of some narrative which can bind the facts of our experiences together into a coherent pattern, and it's in virtue of that narrative that our abstracted rules, our principles, and even our notions gain their full intelligibility, he says. In other words, the stories we tell show us how to understand. They teach us how to see. But no story comes to us in a value-neutral way. Authors' choices about characters show us whether we're supposed to interpret those actions of the characters as good or bad. Walter Fisher, another communication theorist, called this way of viewing reality the narrative paradigm. One initial obstacle we must face here is the idea that the potential subjectivity and emotional appeal that stories seem to include are anathema in some disciplines. But I don't want you to see the narrative paradigm in opposition to what he calls the rational world paradigm, in which humans are essentially rational beings. And thus the world's a set of, as you can see, logical puzzles solved by analysis and the application of reason alone. We're not just reasoning creatures. We're not just rational creatures. And rational argument is not the only or even primary means of constituting what it means to be a human being. Imagine your spouse returning from a difficult shopping trip at the grocery store. As your spouse relates the difficulties that piled on during this time, especially relevant if you've been shopping anytime in the last weekend, from crammed aisles to missing items, broken bottles, and very long lines, you've begun, as she's telling you, or he is telling you this, to rehearse the ways that you could advise her on how to avoid those long lines, how to make her experience easier, how to solve her problem. And as if there are any psychologists in the room know, that's a bad idea. She's telling you her story, or he is telling you his story, making meaning of it, asking you to join in that meaning making, to get her moral point, to support her, to listen and come alongside her, not to rewrite her story. If we limit our conceptions of human nature to rationality alone, then the current glaring failures of the rational world paradigm to train citizens in the basics of logic and rhetoric so that they can fully participate in society become much more dire and obvious. The onus on educators, I think, is higher than we are sometimes led to believe. Without the narrative paradigm, without understanding ourselves as storytelling and story-needing animals, we risk not connecting with our students, not connecting with our friends, and not connecting even with our fundamental natures. We risk miscommunication, ongoing extremism in society, and then breakdown of our communities. The goal is to recapture the whole human being. A second obstacle to overcome that I want to persuade you of is how to figure out ways to apply this in our lives and for us teachers in the classroom. So moving forward, I want to return to the idea of human creatures or human beings as narrative creatures, unpack that a little bit so we can look at its significance, and then move on to offer some practical steps we can take to encourage our students and perhaps ourselves to realize and appeal to our full humanity. So what comprises such humanity then? Aristotle, who's on the left of the screen here, at least what we think he looks like, argued that human beings famously are homo politicus, political animals. He meant by this that we're by nature creatures that seek community and constitute ourselves within those communities. His conception, I'd argue, implies that a rational creature is capable of and willing of discourse using argument in order to seek the happiness and goodness of his or her society. But this is a concept we've seen break down in the modern period. Attacks by existentialism that question the very ability of human beings to be free agents who can determine their existence through acts of the will. The rise of naturalism and its two dominant forms, physical and social, and their accompanying devaluing of moral consensus has led to competing conceptions of the human creature. Some of these competing metaphors: human beings as economic animals, sociological animals, human beings as psychological animals, human beings as ecclesiastical animals, homo sapiens, and of course, rational animals. But people like Fisher don't despair of the competing metaphors. In fact, he offers his own metaphor to add on, borrowing from a larger tradition. Homo narrans, human beings as narrative creatures. This is what Scheherazade understood as she held the mighty king in suspense each night when her very survival depended on it. This is something we can bring to our students and our relationships, our students who are themselves narrative creatures. To be homo narrans is to understand narrative as the master metaphor that contains all the other metaphors of human experience. It, as Fisher says, sets the plot when the others become subplots. Now, I'm not sure we can capture all of what it means to be a human being in a single metaphor, but I think Fisher is pointing us into some productive directions. For Christians, the idea of homo narrans, I think, is particularly poignant. We call the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ the greatest story ever told. The myth that became fact, says C.S. Lewis. And we say Christ is the Logos, as Jacky mentioned, or the Word and reason of God made flesh. Now, this means that rationality is, of course, a defining feature of being made in God's image. But God also chose to reveal himself to us by entering into a relationship with us. He became flesh so that we could understand that revelation, provided his Holy Spirit to guide his revealed word. So we are relational beings because God, a trinity of persons, is a relational being. This is nothing new for most of us. We're made in that image, and we relate to one another through the stories we tell of our experiences, which provide the means by which we empathize, which a variety of research on the effects of story has shown to increase our empathy, the means by which we come to know, and most importantly, to love one another. We have both reason and personality. The scriptures are filled with stories, parables, case you thought my title, or wondering where that was coming in, right? Narratives that reveal God's grace working throughout human history, unfolding a relationship of love that ends in union with our Creator. If I asked each one of you to name important events in the Bible, especially if we asked our kids, right? What are they going to do, right? They're going to relate the event, the stories that we all know. Adam and Eve, Abraham and Isaac, Moses and Israel, David and Goliath, Jesus and his passion and resurrection. The narrative, my point is that we are both rational and relational creatures, and the narrative paradigm combines these two things. It also builds on our creative capacities and our affections or desires as well. Stories, in other words, are the enactment of the whole mind in concert with itself. We want to appeal to our whole students, not just their heads. And we want to appeal to those we live and work with, their entire being. To pursue a vocation means more than just an intellectual pursuit. So why the narrative paradigm, and what is it exactly? Fisher argued that our lives enact dramatic narrative, which he calls the basic and essential genre for the characterization of human narrative. I'm going to try to move this out of your way real quick. There we go. Our human actions. He defines narration as a theory of symbolic actions, words or deeds that have a sequence and meaning for those who live, create, and interpret them. Like plot, which is the sequence of events intentionally structured by an author to bring about meaning, our narratives likewise are intentionally structured to bring about meaning for us and for our audiences. Importantly, this structured sequence brings about that meaning usually through characterization. So what does that mean, right? That's the way that sequence reveals aspects of characters' values, their beliefs, their psychology, in this case, of ourselves in the way we understand our lives. So the characteristics I want to spend special attention to at the moment are intentionality and meaning making. We intentionally do things with our stories, composed of the events of our experiences in order to make meaning of them, because facts don't exist for us, I did say for us, without interpretation. The moment we learn a fact, we have to do something with it. Right? We have to place it within our conceptual frameworks in order to interpret it. In other words, to invest it with meaning. We make the meaning in the sense in which we're the ones responsible for evaluating, placing a value on, the relevance and importance of our experiences. No one can tell you whether meeting your future spouse for the first time was important. Right? You often, in retelling that story to others, over time, make meaning of that first moment. And sometimes that meaning and its significance changes. For example, imagine newlyweds retelling the story of their first meeting to their friends. The joy and enchantment of having the undivided attention of another soul journeying with their own. Pause now and imagine the same story of first meeting being told to an engaged couple by two people who have been together 50 years. The ripe significance of that moment. Looking back through the years of struggle that brought growth and maturity, children and loss, joy, sorrow. It's different now. One more. Imagine an increasingly prominent situation in which a couple has struggled for years with dysfunction. Two people seeking their own self-interest, believing they're victims of not knowing enough about their spouse beforehand, and that only a drastic change can mend their situation. And they divorce in anger, tearing apart the fabric of multiple lives. Now each is asked about the moment they first met their former spouse. How might that story be invested with meaning now? I think you can see my point. Our stories invest meaning in our experiences, and those stories, like human beings, aren't static. They change as we change. When we tell a story and all the pieces of information that go along with it and all those we choose to exclude, we make an argument for a view of reality as we see it. And we want others to see it that way too, because we long to share our visions. Our students, our friends, our colleagues come into our lives with their own narratives, shaped by society's mixed messages and their own past narratives. Because the narrative paradigm then is historical, in other words, as well as situational, this means our stories are competing with other stories, constituted by good reasons, as being rational when they satisfy the demands of narrative probability and narrative fidelity, and as inevitably moral inducements, Fisher says. Well, what does that mean? Well, we demand reasonableness. This is what Fisher calls narrative probability. We demand stories be true to reality, narrative fidelity, and we require a larger meaning, these moral inducements. If I tell you a story about a stranger stopping by the side of the road to help me change a flat tire, I want you to agree about the moral goodness of that act. Or you can do this. I'm inducing an agreement of what constitutes right and wrong in that particular instance. And if you don't, then we have a fundamental disagreement about some aspect of our moral reality, about the meaning of the story. In this case, narrative is not just a genre or a mode, in fact, but an entire paradigm that makes sense of the way we understand our lives. When we offer theories or theology, frameworks or formulas, we must, contends Fisher, consciously strive to keep those statements in intimate contact with the narratives which give rise to our convictions. There's a story of what it means to be a social scientist, a physicist, an engineer, a historian, a theologian, a story of what counts as reliable evidence, credible authority, and good reasons to pursue a given path. Even the work of scientists, as Gerard Holton demonstrated in Thematic Origins of Scientific Thought, is inspired by stories. Holton writes tellingly of the nascent moment in science, the impulse to do science in a particular or new way, how science is informed by themes, whereas the traditionalist paradigm is prescriptive, telling us how we must think in order to reason correctly. The narrative paradigm is descriptive. It offers an account, an understanding of any instance of human choice and human action, including science. Does this mean that all scientists agree on which theories are best? Of course not. Even there are competing moral stories exist. And some don't make it all the way to public moral discourse. But it's not just scientists who can speak with credibility in public moral discourse. We all can. Because narration, Fisher says, is culturally acquired through a universal faculty and experience. It comes closer to capturing our whole experience of the world, while simultaneously appealing to various senses, reason and emotion, intellect, imagination, fact, and value. It's natural. This makes us all capable of being experts who function as storytellers and an audience that are active members in the meaning-making of our stories. Because our stories imply these moral inducements, we function, he says, as counselors in public moral discourse. Anytime we teach, we are potentially offering public moral discourse. Since there are rival stories being told, they compete with one another, as I mentioned. So some stories, though, are better than others, more coherent, more true to the way people in the world are in fact and in value. If we don't understand the stories of others, how to tell our stories within their frameworks for meaning, we usually end up misunderstanding one another, or worse, seeing each other as threats. But stories can be evaluated. So when we're not getting through to someone, it might be that his or her story is different than we expect and requires us to understand that story in order to place our characters within that framework, to translate our shared values into their narratives. Whether we call it stereotype threat or misbelief statements, the narratives we tell in here are powerful. And what we decide about their meaning can affect our learning, can affect our relationships. If the stories we tell portray others as unimportant characters who attempt to negate their self-conceptions, we'll simply talk past each other. So how do we accomplish this? We must tell stories that are narratively probable and faithful. And the most engaging stories, what Fisher said, are mythic. The most helpful and uplifting stories are moral. To make meaning of our discipline, our lives, we must encase them in stories that help others interpret those events. But how do we do this inside the classroom? Everything we do doesn't have to be a story. I'm not saying stand up in front of the class if you're a teacher and just tell stories all day, though you might be surprised at what that would generate. The stories are there. How those math equations came about and how they solve real-world problems already exists. We can even think of our research in terms of a narrative arc. There's a problem that exists. People try to solve it with what ends up probably being a bad solution, or at least not the best, and then a good or better solution is found. That's narrative. That's a story of what happened, and one includes the most fundamental aspects of narrative. The stories we remember are those that create tension through doubt about the outcome. This tension through doubt is a gift to your audience, to your students, to your relationships. When educational gurus tell us to create problems for our students to solve, they're tapping into this drive for narrative. Think about your favorite movies, your favorite stories of discovery within your own disciplines. Often the main character involved fails to solve a problem, tries a new tactic, perhaps with new resources or new skills, and then the final attempt is successful, often with surprises. That success releases our tension. Will Scheherazade run out of stories to satisfy the king, for example? But how do we write such scripts? Think of your lessons as three elements, or maybe your stories in three elements: obstacles, risks, and goals. And that's the order to present them, by the way. Don't be tempted to jump to the goals, even though that's often how we're taught in our planning. You grab an audience by creating doubt, an obstacle to be overcome. How will this company avoid federal charges of misleading the public? How will this chemical solution provide a safe environment for growth? What happens if we don't get this patient on a ventilator in time? When you have obstacles in hand, communicate the risks involved. One way to do this is through dilemma, which highlights competing risks. If X doesn't happen in time, then Y results and we lose Z. Why is solving the obstacle important? What makes it difficult? That difficulty is often the dilemma that creates doubt. And then we sustain that doubt until the end, which we call the resolution. We resolve it, right? By now your audience is aware of your goal, which is to have your main character overcome some major obstacle. We can remind our students of this, resolve the tension by demonstrating how your formula, your historical event, or your character solve the problem, and how they can too. So whether you choose to offer a personal anecdote or biographical excursion, create tension, drama in your narrative. Release the kid in you who loves to hear and to tell stories. Stories inspire us to be better, to avoid pitfalls and harm, to look for what's possible in the midst of struggle and conflict. Teaching and learning are events in the stories we each live, and your calling, should you choose to accept it, is to encourage others to join your worthwhile story and to see value in their own. Like the mighty king in 1001 Nights, stories are life-changing. They captivate us, they give us meaning, they enchant us, they teach us. To resolve some of the conflict I've created, I want you to know that in all versions of the story, Scheherazade is ultimately spared by the king, for different reasons depending on the version. But her story's not truly over. We must pick up Scheherazade's task and go and be storytellers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coley. So as you can see, personal narrative is vital to our vocational tugs. In order to see this at work or in action, if you will, our faculty panel will give us an overview of their stories and how God brought them to this point in their lives. A lot of things that we talk about when we talk about vocation with our students is it's not only where you are, but when you are. That's important. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sean Benson, Professor of English in the Frank W. Mayborne Chair of Arts and Sciences. So as I call you up, come and take a seat. Dr. John Snow, Professor of Mathematics. Dr. Joseph Tabarlet, Professor of Communication and Media Studies, and I would like to invite Dr. Coley to also join our panel if he so wishes. After their presentations, we will hold a Q&A session in which you may ask burning questions about narrative as rhetoric, issues of vocation and calling, or whatever inquiries and curiosities this evening information has generated. Dr. Coley's presentation makes me think my great-grandfather used to tell, he was a boxer, and he used to tell stories of his bouts. And they were always the fights that he won. And his daughter asked him one time, well, Dad, did you ever lose? And he goes, oh yeah, I lost. Well, why don't you ever tell those stories? And he goes, that's the other guy's story. So we're here to listen to the other guy's story. So Doctor, I guess we'll just go ahead and start from the end and come forward. So Dr. Tabarlet, we'll start with you.
My mask so a little bit easier to hear. Well, as Dr. Dumas said, I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about being where I am today, largely because I read a book that I never intended to read, and it changed my life. It was 1988. I was teaching as a visiting instructor and forensics coach at my alma mater, undergraduate alma mater. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my career and the rest of my life. I graduated from my MA program in speech communication a few years before that. But should I go back to graduate school? Should I go back in the same field that I had studied up to that point? Should I go for another field? Should I try something else entirely different, altogether outside of academia? At the time, I was a member of the Quality Paperback Book Club. It doesn't exist anymore in the same form, but it was around for a long time. This is one of those book clubs that, grabbed you by giving you a whole bunch of books for some ridiculous price, like a penny or whatever. And then, of course, you agreed to buy some more books over the next 2 years at regular prices. The record and tape clubs did the same thing, of course. But this was a book club, and like the Book of the Month Club, which was the first of these back post-World War II, they had a deal where they would send you a monthly catalog, and the catalog had on its cover a featured selection or selections. Helpfully, they said that, and I actually found this from some old stuff that I found on the internet, if you want the month's featured selection, you need do nothing. I love the way that's phrased. You need do nothing. It will be sent to you automatically. If you do not want the featured selection, please return the enclosed postage-free card. And of course, if you wish to order any of the other selections in the catalog, all this stuff is capitalized. Featured selections, like it's some kind of major thing. If you wish to order any of the other selections in the catalog, you can do so. Well, you can guess their business model. It was dependent on people like me who forgot to send in the card. And so they would get the book sent to them. And you're stuck with it. One month, there were 2 featured selections. This one, James Glick's Chaos, Making a New Science. And you can tell this is my original copy. It's well-loved, well-read. And Stuart Brand's The Media Lab, Inventing the Future at MIT. This is not my original copy. You can tell it's brand new. I've only had this a few years. My original copy had a wonderful hologram on the cover, but it's long gone. I don't know what happened to it. So I got another copy because I wanted to have a copy of this around. You'll see why. As I did quite often, of course, these were the 2 feature selections. And of course, as I did quite often, I neglected to send in the card. And shortly thereafter, the 2 books arrived, along with an invoice. I was a little disappointed in myself, but figured, hey, it's how I do it. So I bit the bullet and I mailed the check to the QPBC. Only after a few weeks, because I kind of didn't like the books. They represented failure. So I didn't go back to it. But after a few weeks, I became curious, and I thought, well, this Media Lab, that sounds interesting. Chaos is fascinating. I didn't read Chaos till probably 10 years later. Well, no, not quite that late, but 5 or so years later. And it was wonderful. I strongly recommend it, especially if you're a non-scientist, non-mathematician like me, because it explains a very, very crucial idea in science and mathematics. And I want to get involved in that, but it's really, really well done. Written for non-experts in the field. But the Media Lab was really what hit me. Now, I was familiar with the name Stuart Brand. A few years before, I had poured through his Whole Earth software catalog, which he created in the earliest days of the home computer revolution. And I had heard of, I'd never actually read it or used it, but I'd heard of his Whole Earth catalog from the 1960s, which was something that no hippie commune should be without. It was a way to get all kinds of back to the land sort of equipment and really change the idea. I was researching this and I was trying to figure out what Brand actually does. And his Wikipedia entry is very silent on that. It talks about he's a writer. Well, yeah, a lot of people are writers, but he's, as far as I can tell, not any particular area. He just has kind of hit the zeitgeist and been very successful with it. But he's written a lot of other stuff. And I knew who he was. So I started reading it. The Media Lab, though, was different. In it, Brand discussed the then brand new Media Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and discussed the visionaries there, how they were seeing the future of human communication using all manner of shiny new technology. Looking back at the Media Lab from the perspective of 2021, it's easy to see technological trends that Brand, quote, predicted, unquote. And I use the word predicted advisedly because he wasn't really trying to read the tea leaves and tell you what was going to happen. He wasn't one of these people that says the future is going to look like this, because they inevitably end up looking ridiculous. But what he did was he was more of a prophet, actually, because he was speaking to the people at that time and trying to tell them, here are things to look for. Here are things that you're doing that could bear fruit. Study this, go with that. He coined the concept he called broadcast. Now, we all know about broadcasting. That's where you spread things out, right? But broadcast is different. A computer, he said, could be programmed with a television viewer's tastes and desires and entertainment, and then would go out actively hunting for that material, which it would then record and present to the viewer in a curated collection of shows to watch. Today, we call broadcast TiVo. But this was 1987, when you could still choose between a beta and a VHS VCR to record your over-the-air TV program. This was really forward-looking stuff. I remember thinking, that'll never happen. And then 10 years later, there it was. There was Logo, a computer programming language that was intended for children, to teach children how to think as a computer coder thinks. There's a wonderful, heartwarming chapter in the book where Brand visits a classroom where children are making art and designing robots. Elementary school-age children are making all these things using computers. It was fuzzy fonts. It was a way to make text on a TV or computer screen look sharper by, oddly enough, fuzzing up the edges. It actually works. And this was important because at the time, there was no such thing as high-definition television. So if you wanted to have text on a screen, it had to be huge. And that meant you could put very little on a screen, relatively speaking. Fuzzy fonts was a way to make even a low-resolution television screen and computer screen appear to be somewhat sharper, even though it actually didn't increase the resolution at all. That was soon put to use by Apple and IBM. There was a chapter subheading titled, Information Wants to be Politically Free, and it discussed early ideas that would shape the discussion of the internet and later social media. The book was, as they say, a lot. And I spent the time poring over it. I read it, I reread it. But then I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to go back to grad school, get my PhD in mass communication with an emphasis in new communication technologies. And I wanted to teach because I wanted to help other people understand this and appreciate this as I did. Brand's book made me look at communication and technology differently. I saw for the first time that a computer wasn't just a counting machine or a typing machine, it was a communication machine. Later developments only cemented that idea in my head. I remember my response to the internet or the World Wide Web being, well, of course, that's what computers are for. I don't claim any kind of great insight on that, but it just seemed natural that you would use it to communicate in that way. I have a number of maxims that I inflict on my classes, and it's just a way to get a pithy idea across. Don't make the listener or reader work to understand you, is one of my favorites. No one ever complains about a speech being too short. That's another one. But now I have a new one. I learned it from reading Frederick Buechner and other people who have written about vocation and calling. Listen to your life. And it means to being open to the fact that something simple, something seemingly annoying or meaningless, like having to buy a book because you're forgetful, can change your life and help you to find your calling.
All right, I'm Sean Benson. I was asked to talk about how I got here, and so I've only been here for 6 months, so I'd like to talk about my journey to here. And I'll start a little bit later than Dr. Tabarlet did. I'll start when I finished my doctorate back in 1999. At the time, I was exhausted, and I think as many people are when they're working on their doctorate. And I was particularly exhausted from all the reading and writing I've been doing, the research. And I thought to myself, I don't ever want to write again. I don't want to write an article. I don't want to write a book. I don't want to write a footnote. I was tired, and I thought I would be perfectly content doing that. And for several years, I'll say, I went along very happy to be doing that, teaching my classes, not doing any writing, but just enjoying teaching students on a full-time basis. And I still enjoy that, but I would say after several years, I start to feel what I think Professor Coley called that tug. I'd call it a hankering. I had I think, a divine prompting to do something else. I started by just writing an article that interested me. And so I did that. And then I wrote another article, and that sort of kept going. And I continued to find myself more and more interested in doing more writing and adding writing to what I was doing in the classroom, which was, as I said, teaching. It's interesting because I would describe my writing as what, to use Buechner's term, is for me a deep gladness. My talk is really for students. What is it that brings you a deep gladness in your lives and what you're doing? And I found that over time, and it's interesting because I was already quite old and I was an adult, and I found a deep gladness that I had not discovered in graduate school. Even though I'd been doing this, I didn't really like writing in grad school. But I liked when I was out on my own and I could write what I wanted to. And so it became a very interesting thing for me, and I wanted to explore that further. What I've also found is that when I wanted to write, I was teaching, as most people do at a college like this, a 4-4 load, 4 classes in the fall, 4 classes in the spring. And that's a very heavy teaching load. It makes it really challenging to write very much. I found myself spending a lot of time during the summers and vacations doing writing, but that's not really an ideal life unless you want to be working all the time, and I didn't really enjoy that. I did enjoy the writing, but it was just too much. I don't like doing that. So I was looking, eventually I thought to myself, I want to do something a little bit different than what I'm doing. I need a different career path. I want to be doing more writing. And I'd say this it didn't happen overnight. It was a period, again, of several years. And I was thinking about how I would do that. And it's not easy to find a different career path as an academic. So what do you do? Well, it's interesting because about 3 years ago, my I guess not ultimate boss, but my boss, he was the equivalent of what is here the provost, came to me and he said, yeah, I've been thinking I'm going to be retiring in 5 years. I want to groom a successor, and I would like it to be you. And I had no idea that he'd even thought of me. So I was floored. I'd say I was flattered by it. And I thought, wow, maybe that's what I'm called to do. Maybe that's what will give me some more time to write. And as administrators in the room can tell me, that is precisely not the thing you want to do if you want to write more, is to go into administration. I learned this the hard way. But so I told him, I'm not sure, I'll give it a shot. So I did some administrative stuff, and I was still teaching part-time, 2 classes a semester. And what I discovered pretty quickly is I did not like the minutia of administration. And I know there are administrators in here, and I admire you for the work that you do. I don't want to do it. As a friend of mine said, you could never pay me enough to do something that, you just can't pay me enough to do something I don't want to do. But I admire people who do that. I did not like looking at student grade challenges or looking whether a student had satisfied his or her requirements for a degree program, that sort of thing. But then I thought, do I just not like details? Well, that's not the case, because I found out that I do like details. I do a lot of scholarship now, and even though I was tired of it in grad school, I really began to love writing scholarship. I like writing footnotes. I like getting them right, getting them neat, you know, giving insight to people if they want to look at other sources to find things. So I do like minutia, but it's the minutia that comes with writing, doing scholarship. So I realized very quickly that the kind of minutia I like doing was very different than what my provost was asking me to do. And I also had a very good friend who I deeply respect, and he said to me, you know, I see what you're doing, he said, but I don't see your skills and abilities lending themselves to administration. And at first I was kind of offended. How dare you say that to me? But then I thought to myself, he's right. I did not feel deep gladness doing administrative work. I just didn't. And I know people do. It wasn't me. And I had to come to terms with that. And it actually was very useful to me to listen to what he had to say. At the time, one of the good things I did, talk about sort of serendipity, I was leading a group, part of my administrative task, I was leading a group where we got a grant from the NetView, the Network for Vocational Undergraduate Education, where you talk about vocation. And I was leading a reading group, and we were reading a couple books that really gave me insight. One was Gene Veith's book, A God at Work, and the other was Gustav Wingren's book, which I just love, Luther on Vocation, where Luther talked about what it means to have a vocation. And one of the things that Veith in particular said is that a vocation, the word vocation of course comes from vocare, to call. That call often it comes from outside you, and often from friends, family members, people you trust. And when I read that, I thought, my colleague, whom I revere and trust as a very close friend, is telling me the truth about myself, one that I didn't really want to recognize, that I wasn't meant for administration. But then I looked at it, I thought, well, what do I do? If I'm not, my wife said to me, good luck finding a job that's going to allow you to do both things. And I said, you know, maybe, you know, we'll see what happens. And a year ago, this job that I now have came open. And when I saw it, I immediately thought, that's a perfect fit for me. It fits what my deep gladness is and where I can, you know, Buechner says, and I wrote it down when I was listening, vocation is where our deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. It's a very famous quotation. But I would say that to students here. Where does your deep gladness meet the world's deep hunger? If you can answer those questions, then I think you can steer yourself in the right direction. I feel very blessed to be here because I do feel like I was led serendipitously and kind of in a crazy path, but I listened to what I was really good at, and I avoided doing things that I thought would make me not miserable, but not very happy in what I do. I love to come to work. I like that, and that's why I'm here. Yeah. So I think I'll stop there. That's my little anecdote for today.
So I'm John Snow, and I'm a member of the math department, and I think I'm the thing that's different up here. It's not like the others. I spent a lot of time in the last 24 hours thinking about what I was going to say, and I had a plan, and then I made the mistake of right before this we had an interview, and right before that I read some stuff real quick on the internet which shot everything I wanted to say away. And then I sat down, and staring at me behind Dr. Tabarlet is the word flatulence, which is distracting. And so really we have no idea what's about to say. Y'all are the students in here, right? No? Okay, so I think that I'm supposed to address y'all. So I have a friend that when he's teaching, he loves freshman seminar, and he says college students, they're here to learn who am I, why am I here, and where am I going, right? 3 big questions. And he spends a lot of time all semester reading all kinds of things. And the answers to the questions actually are really simple. Who am I? I'm a child of God. Why am I here? I'm here to serve my neighbor. And where am I going? Well, unless your life is very different from everybody else's, you're just going down a long, winding path that's going to have a lot of forks in it, right? And and it's being recorded too, which is great. I didn't pay attention to that part. So when I was your age, and probably up until a few years ago, I really fretted over every decision I ever made. And I had regret over every decision I ever made, right? Because there are all these forks. What do you do with yourself? And my daughter is in college now, and she's trying to pick a major again this week. And the major changes frequently. And she says, I don't have enough information to make these decisions, right? And you're right, you don't have enough information. But that's okay. A lot of times with this, what am I going to do with myself, to choice, people talk about calling. And I talk to my students about vocation. You're called to be where you are to serve those around you in love, right? So talk to the person next to you. Either you're going to serve him, or he's going to serve you, or the conversation is going to serve you both. Something's going to happen. And the students say, yeah, I got that, but what's my big calling, right? What's the big thing I'm going to do with myself? And in recent years, I've come to the conclusion that the mundane stuff every day, that is the big calling, right? So this other thing you're training for, it's your job that's going to put food on your table. It's going to have lots of callings around it too, but really it's all the mundane stuff, right, that we work through. So how did I get here? I think that was the question. That's a really good question. So my dad went to the seminary with a family of 5 when I was 1.5 or 2, and carried me to class with him, right? And I was babysat by so he went to college in this seminary. So I was babysat by his classmates. I was on his knee in the classroom. I was on his knee in Bible studies. So from the time I was 2 up, I was quoting scripture, and it was pretty laid out for me. I was going to be a pastor. I knew where I was going to go to school. I knew which of the 2 Lutheran seminaries I was going to go to. Everything was laid out, and I went to Concordia College in Seward, Nebraska, because I was going to be a pastor, right? And how I got there is really bizarre, but that's this long, windy path with lots of forks. They all wrap around on themselves somehow, right? And little things push you down one fork instead of the other. But once I got to college, there was this feeling inside that this compulsion for the last 18 years of my life was really just to get me there. And we discovered there's this mathematician inside trying to get out. And I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself at that point, because I didn't know what to do with myself, because I'd been going to be a pastor for 18 years, and then who knows. So this guy told me, take another math class. So I took another math class, and I still didn't know what I wanted to do with myself, so I took another math class, and then I took another math class, and 4 years later I had 53 hours of math from 4 different institutions in 4 years, and I figured I should go to grad school. So I went to grad school and got 4 more years of math in. It's extremely rare that you have moments in your life where you have this bright light that says this is what you should do with yourself. That's not typically how they come. And I'm not going to tell one of those stories right now. But all along the way, there are people that are outside saying, you're really good at this, maybe you should try it. Or, hey, can you help me figure this out? Or, you're really not good at that, maybe you should try something else. And as I listened to these voices, and as I prayed about what to do with myself, really I just followed this path. And I have a lot of regrets about some forks I didn't take. I met someone this year that, had I gone to the seminary, he would have been a classmate. And it was really bizarre, right? Because I was getting this glimpse of what I might have been. But on the other hand, I think I would be the same person, right? And so one of my other friends asked, well, do you regret deciding not to go to the seminary and to go to grad school in math, of all things? And regret's not a really good word. I wonder sometimes how things would have turned out. But I really, like I said earlier on in this rambling comment, it's not really about that big decision about what's my job going to be. It's what I'm going to do with myself along the way. And you know, I'm here now. This is where I am. I'll use my gifts to serve UMHB and to serve their students and the people around me. And you know, 10 years from now, who knows where I'll be? This is the 3rd time I'm going up for tenure, right? Maybe I really hope I don't have to do it again, but you know, we'll see what happens. The others were successful. I mean, that's not what caused me to change. You know, I'm really thinking a lot more about the path these days instead of the destination.
Thank you.
I think that's all.
I guess I'm up. I didn't expect to be on this panel till 20 minutes ago.
Because I'm like that, because there's a lot of forking paths.
It's a forking path, and I chose the road of least resistance. Doubt is, I think, the air that faith breathes. So, just building off what John was saying there, there's doubts along the way. I don't feel qualified to offer any advice toward vocation, but I'm not sure that any of us ever do. So all we can do is what I talked about, which is tell stories and hope that that story, one of those stories, resonates with the framework of your own narrative. And I thought I was going to be a youth minister. So I went to a Bible college, and did that a couple years, and then took a couple years off though I was kind of doing schooling part-time. And then came back, and then they had a new degree, an English degree, because it was on the campus of a seminary, very, very small school. And so then I graduated with that English degree and a Bible degree, 2 majors, and I had enough credits for a philosophy minor, and so I had all sorts of things going on. And then I just thought I'll keep going, kind of what you said. I'm not sure exactly what I want to do, but I enjoy learning. So I went to grad school for English. I thought I was going to do literature and specialize in 17th century metaphysical poetry like John Donne. Some of you know who that is. I still love Donne. I get to teach him, so that's fun. But then about halfway through, I took an independent study in composition and rhetoric, which, as Dr. Dumas mentioned, that's actually my field. And that was just so provocative to me that there was a field that combined social science with humanities, and that did empirical research, it did textual research like the humanities, it was focused on answering practical problems and helping students succeed, figuring out how writing works in all sorts of environments. And I thought, wow, that's really crazy. Let's try that. And so I did, and I got a degree in that, and then I went on to a doctoral program and moved I got married halfway through my master's and moved my wife from North Carolina, where I'm from, she's from Texas, up to our Babylonian captivity in Northwest Ohio, 4 years of exile. And then we got to experience it last week again, so that was fun. We thought we had escaped exile. And yeah, so along the way, I always, as English majors, we always meet with English majors each year and talk to them. And one of the questions is kind of how we got to where we are. And very early on, I think I realized that I had always been drawn to the linguistic side of my brain. Obviously, we always say, things like I'm better at English, or I'm not good at math, or in my case, I just didn't flourish in math. And I don't blame that on any teacher, unless it's myself. So I think that people, because I'm a writing teacher, I think that people can become competent in anything like math or science, whether that's their predilection or not. Just certain things have to happen for them, and that didn't happen for me. And I was good at English. I was drawn to that, and along the way, I realized that my research interest had to do with ethics, and my really Christianity. Or Christianity is not mine. Christianity is very important to me. God is very important to me. So that always intersected. Faith always intersected my research. I was drawn to C.S. Lewis. I took a class in my undergrad just on Lewis. The first conversation I had with my wife was about C.S. Lewis. So all sorts of connections there. I just had an article published about C.S. Lewis. And so I realized that the thing that was drawing me, I think, was the idea that Christ is the Word, and that is such an important part of who we are, being rational creatures, linguistic creatures as a consequence, that God communicates through words, and that he structures our mind to understand arguments, because logos also means argument, right, and reason and statement, and that all these things are fundamental to who we are as human beings, and I'm drawn to those things and figuring out why we are, and that writing unlocks some of that in us. And so I get to teach advanced composition, and I love it. I get to tap into students' passion for writing and figure out how it unlocks who they are. And so that I figured out along the way was really provocative, right? That there's this part of us that we can unlock, and we often don't even know what's underneath. And that writing helps us unlock some of that and get it out and learn new things about ourselves while also communicating important messages to the world, communing with other people. So that led me to where I am. Are there days that I wake up and I wonder, what am I doing? Yes, but doubt is the air of faith, right? It's never going away. If it did, you'd be in communion with God, because then you don't need faith, right? Hope and love. Love is the only one that remains, right? There's no more doubt. You can see him right there. And so doubt's not going anywhere. It's kind of embracing that doubt. And I think what Joey said was relevant, and also poignant, the idea that your life speaks to you. And so I think you see the kind of corollary that people saying, people speak into your lives, and God speaks into your life through people, through the things you do, through the passions you have. It might even be through what you thought were your spare time activities, right? If you write on the side, or you, I don't know, sculpt, or you do woodworking or something, maybe God, that is a way that God is speaking to you, because that those passions that are calling to that uniqueness inside of you that is reflecting something unique back to other people about God. So that's, I don't want to go much longer.
So I'd like to take the remaining time that we have to go ahead and open the floor to questions from our audience members. Another round of applause for our panelists. Great stories. Thank you.
That awkward moment.
Yeah, that's always that one phase there.
You got a question right here.
Sure, go ahead.
This is a question for all four of y'all. Where did y'all all start in your undergrad? Like your first major that you declared, and did that change?
It was speech for me, speech communication. I was a debater in high school and did that in college as well. And speech and forensics competition was a big part of my life. I even coached it for a while. And that was the thing that I was going to do. It just seemed natural to me. And I thought at the time that it would lead to perhaps a career in law or something like that. I even went to law school for a short time, and that figured out that wasn't happening. That just wasn't for me. But I always tell my students, one of my maxims is that any type of experience you have will tell you one of two things, at least. It'll tell you what you want to do, and it'll tell you what you don't want to do. And sometimes telling you what you don't want to do is far more valuable information than what you want to do. I mean, you already know what you like. But if you think you like something and then you try it and then, this is no good, that's really important information. But I don't think that the speech communication major was really leading toward that. I was, yes, technically a pre-law major. There really wasn't any pre-law at this institution in any kind of structured sense. But it didn't change. The entire time I was that, and that's what I continued through my master's. And then it changed slightly in my PhD program. But as an undergraduate, started off as a speech major and just went right on through with that.
I was unusual in that way too. I started as an English major and I finished as an English major, though we had the same experience. I thought I was going to go to law school. I did go to law school for a semester, hated it. So you think you know your path, but I might switch very quickly.
I was a psychology major.
I had a double major, history of ideas and biblical studies. And then it switched halfway through to English.
Yeah, I was the same way. I was a psychologist, got my bachelor's in criminal psychology, and ended up getting my master's in classical languages and humanities, and thought I was going to be a football coach for the rest of my career, and that lasted about a decade. In fact, when I got here, my former boss questioned me one time. He goes, Jacky, failed football coaches become principals. They don't become college professors. You know, how did that happen? So, vacillating path. Other questions?
So I think a number of you have referred to this, even in this past discussion. Dr. Dumas talks about the tug. How do you tell the difference between the tug and what you think you're supposed to be doing? Because it's not, again, it's not like you have the light bulb moment always. And aha, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And there's that, so we can convince ourselves that this is what we're supposed to be doing, as opposed to the tug of what we should be doing.
In my case, it was hindsight, unfortunately. I fought the tug. I was going to go to law school as well. I was going to criminal psychology,
Failed lawyers.
go to law school, and throughout, there was kind of this, hey, you would be good at this teaching thing. And so I wanted to go and get my master's next, and so I thought, classical languages, classical humanities to get me prepared for, high academics. And as part of my task was being a TA, and that's when the tug really hit, because I can't remember the specific day, but I remember kind of the moment I was in class. I made a connection, and I was like, I could do this, So, but then I said, no, if law school doesn't work out, that's what I'll do. So the clues were there along the way. I was just too stubborn to listen to them. So yeah, I think and y'all may have different experiences, but I think it would be better off for people to see it, at least the forks, and take the fork because it's a tug rather than fighting it.
I think that idea is very about how do you know it's not just what is expected of you or what you think you might like to do. And I think for both of us, trying law school was that type of thing. Well, this seems like it would be something that I could use the skills and abilities that I have. I enjoy the process of debate and argument, and that kind of what law school is all about. And it kind of is. But I think it was, both of my parents were teachers. In fact, my father was a college professor and administrator. And so there was always that tug back into academia for me, I think, because of that. And I fought it for a long time, but that's what it was.
I think also, again, if you don't focus on this is the thing you have to pick right now. There's all this pressure on 18-year-olds. Pick your major, and they have no idea what to. But if there's a direction where you're using your gifts, you can help the people around you. You're going to get to interact with people. Go with it, and you're going to find out if it's the wrong path. And you'll learn about yourself. You'll learn about the people that you're around. You'll help people along the way. They'll help you. And if you have to go back and take another fork, then so be it. If God really wants you to do something else, He's going to let you know.
And even if it is the wrong path, you will know. And Luther was not real big on switching jobs. His thing was love people where you're at. And you may not love your job, but can you love people through your work, and that's really important, I think, whether you find, that deep gladness, which I hope people do seek that. But even if you can't and don't, can you love them where they're at? Because that's really what I think the calling is, what God's calling is to us, to love people in and through our work.
I think the tug starts with that deep gladness. I think that's, Dr. Peters, I think that may be where you differentiate between what I'm supposed to do and where I'm, I forgot how you phrased it, but the idea of, like I said, I can do this. I like this. I don't know where this is going, but I'm going to follow it. And, the one thing to understand, and especially with the students in the room, the tug is seasonal. I mean, we talked about, students are struggling with what's the big thing, what's the thing I'm supposed to do, and you find that you do something for a little while and then you get tugged somewhere else. Like I said, I was going to be a football coach like my uncle, and then that lasted about a decade, and there, my late 30s or mid 30s, I'm like, existential crisis, what am I supposed to do? This is what I was supposed to do. And for me, getting a doctorate was just something I wanted to do. I'd always been interested in that, just education for education's sake. And my wife was like, you need to go do that because you're wired for teaching. Maybe that's where your path lies. And so, it's not only the tug, but actively listening to those outside voices that God is using to call you, I think is important, and being in tune with listening to that. Yes, Dr. Vassar.
Related to that, I appreciate Dr. Coley's framework on the front end, talking in particular about the marriage couple commonly telling the story, and then Dr. Benson shared about how others had helped him discern his story. So sort of the opposite of the question Dr. Peterson asked about internal voices. What about those external voices? I think, especially for those of us in the liberal arts, the voices we hear at times are not entirely supportive of our vocational choices. How do you discern the good voices from the haters in our vocational exploration?
I personally never had anyone telling me not to go into the liberal arts because my mother was a special education teacher, public ed, so teaching and made sense. But I think the point that Dr. Vash is making is really important, and sometimes we don't listen to our outside voices enough. So I guess one of the things that I think about in terms of vocation in hindsight is many times it does feel like, looking back, you say, I see how God led me here, right? And I think Dr. Snow is right that God's going to put you where he wants you if you stop fighting him, right? And just work where you are, love your neighbors where you are. But it's that tug it's recurring. And that's the other important thing, is that if it keeps coming back, if people keep saying something about it to you, or which the outside voices, hey, you're good at, it come in a variety of forms. If it keeps coming back into your life, then that is probably one way that God is speaking to you, right? If it keeps coming back, especially in places you didn't expect. If it's not like the person who's already, like your parents are supporting you in this thing, they're going to say it. But if it's coming from other sources, that becomes a really clear sign. If you go play a concert somewhere with an instrument and a bunch of people come up and authentically tell you did an amazing job, and maybe they invite you back, that's a different voice than just your parents. And if that kind of stuff keeps happening, that may be an outlet where that sign or signal or voice is speaking into your life. So
I think also we have to be intentional with with the language and the labeling and the definitions that we use, you know, on the front end, you know, from recruiting through, you know, all the way through the education system of that, you know, and a lot of people have heard me say this before, and so, but, you know, not looking at, you know, so our academic core is it's the liberal arts. It's steeped. That's how you explore yourselves, you know, being a child of God and learning how to serve others and finding interest, finding those deep passions, instead of looking at them as checklists. And so, you know, I think having a common language or a common goal to do that would be a good, you'd call it to fight the haters. I think that's the way to go. It's easier said than done though, because there's so many different passions and drives out there with us, particularly with our courses and what we love to do, and but I think also it's just fostering relationships too. You know, getting to know each other, not just our students, but our colleagues and interests, and using those common interests as a way to connect. And I think just modeling interrelationship and interconnection is a great way to do that.
I would say that sometimes it doesn't matter if you are listening to the haters. So this is one of the great things about this concept of vocation, that you can be used where you are to serve those around you. So say you listen to the wrong voice and it puts you into the wrong career, you can still serve there, and you're still going to be used there. And you might, what does it mean to be in the wrong career? So, I mean, maybe you'll change careers later. Maybe you're in a career that's not using all your skills, and you figure that out, right? I mean, you're still going to learn about yourself if you follow that path. And I think that one of the things that happens is most of the people that we end up helping and affecting, we are completely unconscious of. And as long as we're trying to use our skills, we're trying to show the love of God where we are, then He's going to use us, and He'll be effective in spite of us. And so if you listen to the wrong voice now and then but you're really trying, right? I mean, stay in the Word, pray, listen to people around you, and go boldly forth. And God will use you, and if He wants you somewhere else, then you're going to end up somewhere else.
One of the things that I'm thinking about more and more in regard to calling is the role of grace. And to go along with the narrative presentation, which I really appreciated, psychologists are talking a lot about redemptive stories. And it seems to me that there's something about calling that at the core of it is an encounter with grace, that I am finding something that is a voice. When you mentioned your wife saying you need to do this, and going back to Dr. Vassar's point about voices, it seems to me that voices of people that are invested in you in some way are much more worth listening to than voices of people that don't know you. And I had somebody very negative one time in my life, and I thought, they don't know who I am. And then I've had people that really did know, and those voices were important, but they came to me as a kind of voice of grace. And I wondered, the question for you all is, can you put into words how you've experienced grace in your story? I think we've heard it. I just wanted you to kind of think a little more specifically. Is there a sense that you could articulate about that? Experience of grace. That's too esoteric.
I think most of, and I'm hitting on the point of the redemptive part of our narrative. I think there's several redemption narratives that we can tell in our own lives. And I think if we hold on to those and see, kind of like the tug in hindsight, seeing where you've been tugged, I think connecting the dots of the redemptive stories, the redemptive nature, shows just how vast God's love is for us. It's like I often tell my students, we'll do a mental exercise, and I say, okay, think of the most amazing sight, particularly if it's nature, something like that. You know, someplace where, and I'm usually talking about the sublime. You know, where you just felt emotionally overwhelmed and understand that, you know, the greatness of the world out there, the God that's created that, and just how small you feel. And then I tell them, you know, well, understand that the same God that created all that created you. And so I think looking back at those moments where we take stock of saying, you know, God created me. He put me in this certain place at this certain time. Any other place and any other time it wouldn't work. But at this point it does. And I think we all have those narratives where we see, you know, him drawing us to that particular place and time. The when and where, like I said. Other final questions?
I just want to say one thing related to that real quick. I think that's what the story of vocation is. I mean, I could just stop there and leave it, let you unpack that. But I mean, that's what all these stories, that's what any vocational story is. It's a story of grace, first, middle, last. Because you're asking, how did I get here? Well, God got me here. And I couldn't tell you how I got here. Even if I look back and I can say, God led me to this choice, instead of this choice, to go to this place, instead of this place. But at the time, you know, who knows? So really, to me, vocation, that whole story is a story of grace.
When I talk to students, I often say to them, what are your abilities and interests? But the better way to say it is really, what abilities has God given you and what interests has he led you to? So it is all about grace, that whatever you have, it is God's gift to you to use. And if you are using it, it's because he has allowed you and encouraged you to do that.
I think that's actually a good place to end.